claimed he was innocent, until Poirot discovered he'd murdered the only thing that could prove it. Welcome to Poirot Puzzles. I am your host, Creighton. I'd love to know, where are you joining us from as we unravel this case? Your thoughts and comments truly make this journey richer. Let's dive in. The letter arrived at exactly 10 minutes past 4, carried by a red-faced footman who looked far too young to be entrusted with scandal. He handed it to Miss Felicia Marchmont without a word, and retreated down the stone steps of the Marchmont estate in Surrey, as if the parchment burned through his gloves. Felicia, the younger sister of the late Lord Gerald Marchmont, slit the envelope without hesitation, expecting another condolence or perhaps a legal detail from the family solicitor. Instead, her fingers trembled as she read the unsigned words written in an erratic, angular hand. Your brother's death was no accident. The alibi is a lie. He killed it himself. Less than 2 weeks had passed since Lord Gerald's body was discovered sprawled in the study, his head resting at a peculiar angle against the fireplace fender, whiskey decanter still uncorked on the table. The official cause had been ruled an accident. He had apparently slipped and struck his temple against the stone hearth while fetching a fresh cigar. His manservant, Parkinson, had found him the next morning. The inquest closed without delay. The will was read. The estate began transitioning to his eldest nephew, Anthony Marchmont. And just as the household prepared to mourn in peace, the mystery arrived with a single envelope. But there was one detail about Gerald's final evening that had never sat well with Felicia. At the precise hour of his death, Gerald was said to have been attending the annual Claverton Gentlemen's Club banquet in London. An alibi confirmed by no fewer than 9 witnesses, including 2 members of Parliament and a retired High Court judge. Parkinson, it was said, had merely been mistaken about the time he discovered the body. An easy error, the coroner had insisted. And yet, here it was. A letter that did not claim the alibi was faked, but that the alibi itself had been murdered. 3 days later, Hercule Poirot, on holiday in nearby Farncombe, was discreetly summoned to the Marchmont estate. The request came not from Felicia, but from Inspector Ramsden, a former pupil of Poirot's lectures at the Wargrave Institute, who now held a quiet post in the local police. Ramsden was not convinced by the case's open and shut conclusion. He had neither the prestige nor the evidence to launch an inquiry, but he had a conscience and a memory of Poirot's gift for seeing where others did not. The Belgian detective arrived promptly, wearing a dove-grey suit, gloves of light suede, and a carnation in his buttonhole. His moustaches were immaculate. He greeted Inspector Ramsden with warmth, but did not immediately agree to take the case. "Mon ami," Poirot said, raising one eyebrow as he glanced over the edge of the envelope. "You do not bring me a murder. You bring me an enigma of character, and this I cannot resist." They were seated in the late Lord Marchmont's study, a chamber full of heavy walnut, dark tartan, and a grandfather clock whose ticking seemed louder in the silence that followed Gerald's death. Poirot examined the space with narrowed eyes, touching nothing, allowing the room to speak for itself. He stood for several minutes in front of the fireplace where Gerald's body had been found. He noted the position of the decanter, the scuffed hearthrug, the candlestick left slightly askew on the mantel. Then he moved to the leather armchair beside the desk, where Gerald was last seen alive by his butler, and finally paused in front of the clock. "Mon cher Ramsden," he said at last, "we begin not with the alibi, but with the man. To tuer son propre alibi, c'est une idée rare. Either Lord Marchmont died for a secret, or he died hiding one." Poirot returned to the desk, opening a leather-bound journal that had been left untouched since the family sealed the room. Inside were no dramatic entries, no ominous farewells. Just one notation in Gerald's tight, angular script. "See dinner, Cavendish." The date matched the evening of his death. Cavendish referred to Sir Reginald Cavendish, one of the guests who swore Gerald had dined with them until nearly midnight. Poirot closed the book carefully. "Tell me, Ramsden, do you trust a man who insists a thing happened simply because he was there to witness it?" Ramsden hesitated. "In most cases, yes." "Ah, then let us examine this case as the exception." With that, Poirot agreed to remain in the village under the guise of visiting an old friend, and he began to probe the edges of a mystery that had not yet been declared one. The family, still deep in mourning, received his presence with uncertain politeness. Felicia was more forthcoming than her brother's widow, the elegant but impenetrable Helena Marchmont, whose calmness Poirot regarded with careful interest. The Marchmonts were old money and old pride. The estate was filled with faded paintings, echoing footsteps, and silences too loud to ignore. Beneath their courtesy, Poirot sensed nerves strung tight, not from grief, but from dread. By week's end, he had assembled a private list of the night's witnesses, as well as a map of Lord Marchmont's final hours. But something odd emerged. The times almost matched, but not perfectly. There were subtle inconsistencies. A conversation recalled at 9:15 by one man that another swore took place after 10. A dropped handkerchief that no one remembered seeing, and a curious footnote about a brand of cigar Gerald loathed. Yet one was found burning in the ashtray next to his body. Already, Poirot mused, the alibi begins to tremble. We shall see soon whether it shatters. And in the privacy of his hotel room, he unfolded the letter one last time, holding it beneath the lamp. There was no signature, no watermark, just a faint crease across the bottom corner, as though it had once been folded hastily, reopened, and folded again. Poirot tapped his chin. "Yes," he whispered. "Someone sent this with fear, but not to expose the murderer. Non, to test who would come looking." The real crime had yet to surface, but already Poirot could smell the motive buried in the ash and the ink. By the following morning, Hercule Poirot had taken up residence in a modest suite at the White Hart Inn, a half-hour's walk from the Marchmont estate, though Poirot, naturally, preferred to be driven. He awoke early, breakfasted on boiled eggs of precisely 3 minutes, and summoned Inspector Ramsden to begin what he called the delicate art of untangling the truth from polite fiction. Ramsden, notebook already in hand, briefed Poirot on the principal members of Lord Marchmont's circle, who had formed the core of the evening's alibi, the very men and women whose memories, testimonies, and perhaps loyalties now required surgical dissection. There were 5 central figures present at the Claverton Club dinner on the night of Lord Marchmont's death. Each had given a clear, confident account of Gerald's presence, placing him firmly among them from 8 until just before midnight. Yet Poirot was unconvinced, not because he doubted their sincerity, but because their stories were too consistent. Uniformity, he told Ramsden, is not the hallmark of truth, but of rehearsal. First among them was Sir Reginald Cavendish, retired civil servant and long-time friend of the Marchmont family. A man of ceremonial sentences and waistcoats with pocket watches, Cavendish had claimed to share a brandy with Gerald at precisely 10:30 while discussing tariffs on imported tobacco. He lived in a Georgian townhouse in Chelsea, and, when invited by Poirot to tea, arrived punctually and recited his account without hesitation. Poirot noted, however, that when asked which chair Gerald had occupied, Sir Reginald faltered. "The third from the right," he said, "or perhaps the second. They were identical, you know." Second was Anthony Marchmont, Gerald's nephew and heir to the estate, whose alibi was curiously entangled with that of his uncle. Anthony had been at the banquet as well, though he claimed to have arrived late and departed early, citing a migraine. The timing of his exit placed him at the scene just long enough to confirm Gerald's presence, but not long enough to be questioned further. Poirot raised an eyebrow when Anthony mentioned stopping for a walk after leaving the club. "In January?" he asked, at nearly midnight. Anthony flushed slightly. "Fresh air helps the nerves," he replied. Poirot made a note. The third was Eustace Whitaker, a fellow club member and known raconteur who delighted in wine and gossip with equal flair. He had described the evening's menu in excruciating detail when interviewed: oysters, beef Wellington, a tragically overdone soufflé, but stumbled when asked what Gerald had worn. "A dinner jacket," he said vaguely. "Possibly a grey tie. Or was it black? Dash it, Poirot. What does it matter?" Fourth was Dr. Alice Breton, a psychologist and friend of Helena Marchmont, who had been present as a guest speaker that night, lecturing briefly on social masks and their criminal implications. Poirot found her calm, inquisitive, and difficult to rattle. She stated with quiet confidence that Gerald had listened intently to her remarks, and even quoted her the next morning in a letter of thanks, now missing. His handwriting, she observed, was unusually small. "I remember because he cramped entire lines between margins." Poirot was intrigued, not by the detail, but by how quickly she'd offered it. And lastly, there was Helena Marchmont, Gerald's widow, poised and composed, who insisted she had remained at home that evening with a headache and had nothing to contribute. She offered no suspicion, no theories, no emotion. Poirot's questions were met with smooth answers, but her gaze, steady and unreadable, gave him pause. "A woman," he murmured afterward, "who does not wish to forget, but rather does not wish to remember." Poirot requested to interview each of the five again, this time not in drawing rooms or parlours, but within the Marchmont estate itself, beginning with Sir Reginald. Felicia, cooperative and nervous, arranged for their presence under the pretence of a commemorative gathering. Poirot's purpose was clear. He intended to walk each guest through their version of events, not in theory, but in space, letting the rooms and their memories contradict each other. As they entered the study, Sir Reginald paused by the fireplace. "It's just as I remember it," he remarked. Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but you said this was where you spoke with Lord Marchmont at the club, no?" Cavendish blinked. "Yes. Of course, I mean it reminds me of the club room. Similar furnishings." Poirot nodded slowly. "Of course." Throughout the day, Poirot watched not what the guests said, but what they didn't. When Anthony walked through the study, he stopped abruptly near the drinks cabinet and asked, "Wasn't this moved since that night?" It hadn't been. Eustace, meanwhile, kept to generalities, laughing nervously and refusing to touch anything. Dr. Breton studied the ashtray for a full 5 seconds before saying, "The cigar's wrong. He smoked Turkish blends, always did." Helena declined to participate in the reenactment. "I prefer to remember him as he was, not where he died," she said. Poirot accepted this, but filed it away silently. In truth, it confirmed something he had suspected. Helena was concealing more than sorrow. By dusk, Poirot had identified a pattern, not of lies, but of omissions. Each guest remembered Gerald's presence at the club in ways that suited their relationship to him. None had been with him every moment. All deferred to the timeline with a curious exactness. Poirot turned to Ramsden and spoke quietly. "Do you see, mon ami? The witnesses, they construct not a shield for Gerald, but a silhouette. It is the illusion of an alibi, not its truth. And that," he added, tapping his forehead, "is what only the murderer would desire." That evening, Poirot returned to the White Hart Inn and began his notes in earnest. He sketched the timeline, the contradictions, the cigar. But most of all, he pondered the phrase from the letter, "He killed it himself." Perhaps Gerald had orchestrated the illusion of an alibi to protect someone else. Or perhaps he had intended it as a trap. Either way, Poirot knew the alibi was not proof of Gerald's life that night. It was the evidence of a murder no one had yet declared. The next morning brought with it a thick winter fog, draping the Marchmont estate in a pale shroud as if the grounds themselves were reluctant to reveal anything further. Poirot, never one to be delayed by the elements, arrived precisely at 10, gloved and buttoned, with a notebook tucked under his arm and a faint smile on his lips. It was not merely a visit. This was his formal entry into the investigation, and he intended to make it known. Felicia met him in the drawing-room, visibly flustered and anxious. "I've asked everyone to gather in the salon after tea," she said, glancing nervously toward the hallway. "I told them it was a private commemoration, a final reflection on Gerald's passing." Poirot gave a slight nod. "An admirable pretext, mademoiselle. In such settings, it is not only the mouth that speaks. The silences are most instructive." Inspector Ramsden joined them moments later, sleeves already dusted with chalk from his early walk through the stables. Though he had nominal authority, he deferred to Poirot now, understanding that the older man's presence had already shifted the atmosphere. Poirot turned to him with quiet satisfaction. "Today," he said softly, "we allow them to speak, freely and often. We do not accuse, we do not confront. We listen." By midday, the Marchmont salon had filled with guests once again. Sir Reginald Cavendish arrived in a grey overcoat with a silk scarf neatly looped around his neck. Anthony Marchmont stood near the French doors, arms crossed, impatiently tapping a polished shoe. Eustace Whittaker took the armchair nearest the fireplace, glancing occasionally at the flames as if they might offer distraction. Dr. Alice Bretton stood alone, posture straight, hands clasped behind her back, studying the paintings on the far wall. And Helena Marchmont entered last, gliding in with effortless calm, her black dress flawless, her gaze unreadable. She said little, simply took a seat and nodded to no one in particular. Poirot waited until the tea had been served and the initial pleasantries exchanged. He stood slowly, brushing a single invisible thread from his sleeve. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I thank you for allowing me into your confidence. As you are aware, the circumstances of Lord Marchmont's death have been deemed accidental. And yet, there are whisperings, quiet ones, discreet." He paused, then added softly, "A single letter, unsigned. It suggests that what we accept may not be what was." At this, Anthony shifted in his chair. "So we're to upend the family peace for a hoax?" he muttered. Poirot turned to him gently. "Monsieur, peace that rests upon silence is a fragile thing. We seek not scandal, but understanding. For if there is no foul play, then you may rest easier than before." He addressed them not as a detective, but as a guest, his questions light, often disguised as curiosity. "Sir Reginald, you spoke with Lord Marchmont at the club. What was his mood?" Cavendish leaned forward. "Cheerful, I'd say. Perhaps a touch subdued, but he'd had a drink or two. Nothing unusual." Poirot nodded. "And you, Mr. Whittaker, did Lord Marchmont remain seated for most of the evening?" Eustace chuckled, clearly uncomfortable. "He wasn't one to bounce around. Sat to my left most of the night, if I remember." Poirot raised an eyebrow. But Sir Reginald places him to the right. Curious, no? Perhaps the chairs were rearranged?" Silence fell. Whittaker's mouth opened slightly. "Well, perhaps I'm misremembering." Poirot did not press. He merely turned away, allowing the contradiction to settle. Then Dr. Bretton cleared her throat. "Are you suggesting one of us lied about Gerald's presence?" Poirot's tone remained pleasant. "Not at all, madame. I suggest only that memory, like vision, is subject to distortion, especially when one sees what one expects." Helena, who had remained quiet, now spoke. "You're searching for motive, but everyone here admired Gerald. What possible cause would there be for—" She hesitated. "Violence." Poirot approached the mantel, gazing at the row of framed photographs. "Sometimes, madame, it is not hatred that moves the hand, but fear, or protection, or inheritance." Anthony stood abruptly. Are we truly to pretend this is some grand murder mystery? He snapped. Gerald had no enemies. His death was tragic, yes, but to twist it into something sordid is disgraceful. Poirot fixed him with a calm stare. It is not sordid to seek the truth, monsieur. It is cowardly to avoid it. After the gathering dispersed, Poirot requested brief private interviews with each guest. Felicia lingered nearby, offering timid reassurances and nervous glances. Ramsden shadowed the interviews silently, his expression increasingly taut. Sir Reginald Cavendish returned first. Poirot asked him to recount, again, the details of the dinner, this time including what Lord Marchmont had not done. Did he excuse himself? Did he speak to the staff? Did anyone question his presence? Cavendish furrowed his brow. Well, no, I suppose not. We were all so used to Gerald's company. Poirot nodded. Ah, habit. It creates certainty without proof. Anthony Marchmont followed, now more defensive than before. I'm not answering riddles, he snapped. Poirot merely smiled. You were the first to arrive at the body? No. Anthony stiffened. I arrived the morning after. Parkinson discovered him first. Poirot pressed lightly. Yet you were quick to assume the death was accidental. Why? Anthony opened his mouth, hesitated, then said, because it made sense. Poirot's voice softened, or because it was easier than the alternative. Eustace Whittaker arrived next, visibly sweating. I don't know what you expect from me, he said, trying to sound affable. I barely noticed the man that night. Poirot tilted his head. But you spoke at length about the wine, the oysters, the soufflé, and yet you do not recall the man beside you. Eustace chuckled weakly. That's different. Food stands out. People blend together. Poirot murmured, Indeed, especially when you don't look too closely. Dr. Alice Breton was direct and measured. You want to know what I noticed, she said. Fine. Gerald was distracted, not disengaged. Distracted. I assumed it was grief. He'd mentioned in passing that he and Helena had quarrelled. Poirot took interest. Ah? Quarrelled over what, madame? She shook her head. He didn't elaborate. Only that there were matters of legacy he regretted. Poirot folded his arms. A man regrets what he cannot undo. Finally, Helena Marchmont entered. Her voice was cool. I imagine this is all quite entertaining for you. Poirot did not rise. Madame, it is not entertainment, it is observation. She regarded him for a long moment. You think Gerald faked his presence at the club? That he slipped away and returned here only to die? Poirot shrugged gently. I think someone had cause to create his presence, and if so, he was either dead before the clock struck midnight, or he was never in London at all. Helena's expression did not change, but a flicker passed through her eyes. So quickly it might have been a shadow. After she left, Ramsden leaned in. What now? He asked. Poirot did not answer immediately. He returned to the fireplace, staring at the polished stone. Then he turned to the window, watching the last of the guests cross the courtyard. Now, he said slowly, we look not for what is hidden, but what is assumed. Every alibi relies not only on time, but on presence. And presence, mon ami, is the easiest illusion of all. He tapped his notebook. One of them lied, but not about the event. They lied about the man. The man they saw was not Lord Marchmont, but a role played, a shadow in his shape. He smiled to be the next morning. Poirot had requested the formal cooperation of the Marchmont household staff, those who had served under Lord Gerald in the weeks and days before his death. The servants had been quietly anxious ever since Poirot's arrival, unsure whether this soft-spoken stranger was there to uncover a mistake or lay blame. Felicia, ever the intermediary, assured them it was simply a private clarification of facts, though her tone lacked conviction. Poirot, however, approached them not with accusations but with calm curiosity, and slowly the pieces began to shift. He began with Parkinson, the faithful manservant who had discovered Gerald's body. Parkinson was tall, gaunt, and habitually folded his hands before speaking. His lordship was in good spirits the day before, he said. Had his usual whiskey at 6:30, no visitors but Miss Felicia, retired to the study around 9. Poirot raised a finger, but at that time he was to be in London, no? Parkinson blinked. Yes, sir, that's what I was told. He left just before 6 for the train. I assisted with his coat and hat. Poirot made a note. Did he travel alone? Parkinson nodded. Yes, sir, alone. Said he didn't require the driver. Poirot leaned forward. And the next morning, how did you discover the body? Parkinson hesitated. At 7:30, I brought in the breakfast tray. The door was ajar. He was lying by the hearth. I called for help, but... His voice trailed off. Poirot asked gently, and the clock on the mantel, what time had it stopped at? Parkinson frowned. Midnight? Just past. I thought nothing of it. Poirot nodded. But a body at rest for 7 hours, mon ami. It tells its own story, and yours is consistent, but... He paused, not complete. Next came Mrs. Foyle, the housekeeper. She had served the family for over 20 years and remained loyal to Gerald's memory. His lordship was troubled lately, she said, adjusting the hem of her apron. He often walked alone in the gardens. Sometimes at night. I never pried. He wasn't the sort to confide. Poirot asked, Did you notice anything odd the night he died? She looked uncertain. Well, the study door was locked. That was unusual. Normally Parkinson checks on him, but it was bolted from the inside. We had to use the spare key in the morning. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Locked doors are most curious, madame. They protect. But from whom? She looked puzzled. I assumed. Perhaps he didn't want to be disturbed. Poirot thanked her and moved on. He then spoke with Timothy, the young gardener who, while not part of the main staff, had been tending the hedges near the study window on the evening in question. Saw lights still on just before 10, he said. Thought it odd, since the master was supposed to be away. But maybe Miss Felicia was, reading. Poirot tilted his head. You saw someone inside? Timothy hesitated. A shadow, maybe. Someone moving. Could have been Parkinson. Didn't think much of it. Poirot scribbled the remark down. A movement inside the supposedly empty study, at a time when Gerald was meant to be in London. A locked door, a stopped clock, and a body in the morning. The contradictions, he murmured. They accumulate like dust. Finally, Poirot sought out Madame Carlyle, Helena's lady's maid. Though reluctant at first, she yielded to his questions under his careful, polite pressure. Madame was alone that night, she said. I brought her sleeping tonic at 9, then she asked not to be disturbed. She remained in her room until late morning. Poirot inquired, and did she seem distressed? Madame Carlyle's eyes flicked sideways. Not distressed, monsieur, just tired, quiet, but not surprised, if that is what you are asking. Poirot pressed gently. Not surprised? She looked flustered. Forgive me. I meant she was calm, too calm perhaps, but everyone handles grief differently. Poirot nodded. Indeed, and some grief begins before the loss. Having spoken with the staff, Poirot returned to Inspector Ramsden with a narrowed list of inconsistencies. We are no closer to a motive, Ramsden said, frustrated. But now we have even more confusion, a shadow in the study, a locked door, a silent wife. Where do we even begin to sift the truth? Poirot smiled faintly. We begin, mon ami, by removing what cannot be. Gerald could not have been in London and the study at once. Therefore, either he did not attend the dinner, or someone else did in his place. Ramsden frowned. You think the alibi was forged? Poirot raised a finger. Not entirely. Only altered. If the dinner guests believe they saw Gerald, then we must ask, what exactly did they see? He arranged the testimonies side by side, drawing invisible threads between them. Sir Reginald mentioned brandy and cigars, but Gerald despised cigars, no. Mr. Whittaker described him in a black tie, but Gerald wore grey with a club pin. Dr. Breton remembers his comments, but not his voice. These are not memories. They are impressions. Ramsden nodded slowly. So who would impersonate him? Who would know his gait, his clothes, his speech? Poirot stared at the page. Only one who lived alongside him, and who would benefit from the illusion. That afternoon, Poirot called again on Felicia Marchmont. She was in the conservatory, pruning roses half-heartedly. When he arrived, she set the shears aside. "Have you found something?" she asked. Poirot smiled. "Not something, mademoiselle. Someone." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Poirot gestured for her to sit. "Tell me of your brother's habits, his quirks, his routines." She looked uncertain. "He was meticulous, very set in his ways, always dined at the same hour, drank the same brand of whiskey, wore a lapel pin every Thursday." Poirot interrupted. "Thursday?" She nodded. "Club meeting night." Poirot rose abruptly. Then the pin on the man at the club dinner was out of place, because the dinner was on a Wednesday. Felicia paled. "You think that wasn't Gerald?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "I think it was someone who knew Gerald well enough to impersonate him, but not well enough to notice the small errors. The wrong tie, the cigar, the pin. But why?" she whispered. "To protect someone, to cover a secret." Poirot's voice dropped. "Or to make sure Gerald's death looked natural, so that no one would question where he was that night." Felicia was silent. Then she said quietly, "Anthony. He knows how Gerald walks, speaks. He used to imitate him at parties. It infuriated Gerald." Poirot said nothing, but the idea had already taken root. The air, the mimic, the man with everything to gain, and just enough knowledge to build a fragile illusion. Back at the White Hart Inn, Poirot compiled his findings. Gerald's presence at the club had been accepted, not verified. A body found in a locked room, yet no sign of a struggle. A timeline that was too perfect. And now, a motive that stretched beyond inheritance. It stretched into performance. Someone, he thought, is hiding not a crime, but a play. And like all plays, it will fall apart under light. But one question still lingered. Who sent the letter? Poirot returned once more to the strange phrasing. He killed his own alibi. Not was killed, not was framed. That implied intention. Gerald had a role in his own deception. Was it possible he had been complicit in something and then eliminated? Poirot stared at the fire until the embers blurred. There was more to come, and he intended to draw the curtain, scene by scene, until the final act played. The next day began with a surprise. A new letter. This time it had been slid beneath Poirot's door at the White Hart Inn sometime during the night. There was no envelope, no stamp, just a single folded sheet, the same stiff parchment as the first, the same jagged handwriting. Poirot read it over a simple breakfast, savoring each word like a riddle served on toast. "You're looking in the wrong direction. The nephew was always too obvious. Ask yourself why Gerald stopped going to the club regularly last month. Ask about the letter Helena burned." Poirot set the toast down. Later that morning, when Ramsden arrived, Poirot handed him the page without a word. Ramsden read it twice. So now we're to think Helena burned something. What letter? And why would she do it? Poirot murmured. "Ah, my friend, perhaps she burned a secret. Or perhaps she burned a man's final attempt at truth. Either way, this," he tapped the paper, is bait. The author wants to move our eyes away from Anthony Marchmont. The question is whether they wish to protect him or frame him. At noon, Poirot returned to the estate. The Marchmont house was as silent as a mausoleum, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from waiting. He requested to see Helena. She met him in the west sitting room, standing by the window, sunlight striping the carpet beneath her feet. "You have more questions, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked. I had rather thought we were finished. Poirot gave a small bow. "Alas, madame, the truth insists on one final conversation." He stepped closer. "Tell me, did you burn a letter? One written by Lord Marchmont?" She didn't flinch. "Yes." Poirot blinked. Helena's gaze didn't shift. "He left it on my dressing table the day before he died. I read it, and I destroyed it." Poirot tilted his head. "And what was its content?" Her voice was even. "It was not a confession, if that's what you expect. It was regret. About our marriage. About the legacy. About the decisions he made that betrayed others to preserve himself. There was nothing concrete, nothing criminal." "Then why destroy it? Because the past does not deserve to dictate the living?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. He stared at her a moment longer, then turned to leave. At the threshold he said softly, "But sometimes, madame, it is the dead who demand justice, not the living." Later that day, Inspector Ramsden returned from a background search on Anthony Marchmont. The results were striking. 3 months prior to Gerald's death, Anthony had been rejected from a private investment deal Gerald had intended to fund. Ramsden frowned. It would have made Anthony a wealthy man. Gerald said no, told him to earn it, not inherit it. According to the solicitor, Anthony was furious. Poirot nodded. "So, there is motive, there is knowledge, there is access. But the portrait, Ramsden, it is too neat." "Too neat?" "Oui. As you say, it is the perfect shape, which makes it suspicious. The author of the second letter warns us of the obvious. Perhaps they are right." They brought Anthony in for questioning under the guise of reviewing the will. Poirot let Ramsden lead the conversation, watching the young man carefully. Anthony was composed, if slightly irritated. Poirot spoke gently. "Monsieur Marchmont, I must ask, on the night of your uncle's death, where were you between 10 and midnight?" Anthony folded his arms. "As I've said, I left the club around 10, walked through Temple Gardens, went back to my flat." Poirot nodded. "And can anyone confirm this?" A pause. "Number I live alone." Poirot leaned forward. "Did you impersonate your uncle at the Claverton Club?" Anthony's eyes widened. "What? You imitated him often?" Poirot said smoothly. "Your cousin Felicia recalled it." Anthony scoffed. "When I was younger, for laughs. Not in a packed dining hall filled with half the House of Lords. But if someone had instructed you, coached you, helped you pull off such a deception." "I didn't." Poirot watched him. "Yet if someone did, and then turned on you." Anthony leaned back. "So this is what you've been building up to? That I killed my own uncle and then invented a dinner to cover it up?" "You are not accused," Poirot said mildly. "Only considered." Anthony stood. "Then I suggest you start considering someone else." Poirot let him go. When Ramsden sighed, Poirot nodded. "There. You see? The anger. It is real. But not the fear." That evening, Felicia approached Poirot quietly, holding a bundle of papers. "I found these in Gerald's locked drawer," she whispered. "I wasn't supposed to go in there. But I remembered what you said, about presence, about assumption." The bundle included several personal notes and one torn scrap that caught Poirot's attention. "Reginald knew. He warned me. But it's too late now." Poirot read it 3 times. "Reginald knew what?" he muttered. The next morning, Poirot requested another private audience, this time with Sir Reginald Cavendish. The older man was reluctant but polite. "Sir Reginald," Poirot said, "I believe you are protecting Gerald. Not merely covering his tracks, but shielding him from disgrace. Or worse." Cavendish hesitated. He was a good man. Proud. Foolish sometimes, but not a criminal. Poirot leaned forward. "What did you know, Sir Reginald?" Silence. Finally, a quiet admission. "He told me he feared for his life, that he'd made a mistake with the inheritance, that someone had discovered it." Poirot's voice lowered. "Who?" "I assumed it was Anthony, but now, I'm not sure." "Why not?" Cavendish looked away. "Because Gerald didn't name him. He just said, 'They know.'" Poirot sat back. "Then the alibi wasn't only constructed to protect the timeline, it was constructed to protect his fear." Cavendish nodded slowly. "He asked me to vouch for him at the club, whether he came or not. Said he might need it." Poirot was silent. The false lead had served his purpose. Anthony, it seemed, had motive and opportunity, but not the mindset. The anger was genuine, but Poirot had seen no signs of guilt. More importantly, the true deception was not one man impersonating another. It was a collective illusion, built piece by piece through silence, omission, and old loyalties. And now the net was closing. Only one person had both knowledge of Gerald's regrets and the personal detachment to wield them. Poirot stood alone at the window, the fog rolling across the estate once more. He feared disgrace, he feared exposure, but someone feared him more, someone whose alibi was not forged, but inherited. The next step would not be an interview. It would be a trap. Poirot returned to the Marchmont estate the next morning under the guise of a routine visit. He was escorted once again to the drawing room where Felicia sat with a book unopened in her lap. Her posture was strained and her eyes, usually downcast, were now fixed on the fireplace which had remained unlit since her brother's death. The air in the room was tight with something unsaid. He did not sit. "Felicia," Poirot began quietly, "you must trust that what I do now, I do not out of suspicion, but necessity. There is someone among us who believes themselves safe, who thinks they have buried not just Lord Marchmont, but the evidence of their crime. I intend to show them they have not." She nodded, barely. Poirot turned and requested that the family gather once more that evening. Not a formal meeting, not yet, simply a commemorative supper, a gentle echo of the night in question. Felicia, understanding what he was about, sent the invitations herself. The seating, the food, even the music played faintly from the gramophone. Every detail was designed to evoke the Claverton Club dinner. Except this time, the guest list would be smaller, more intimate. That night the gathering took place in the dining room, long disused since Gerald's death. Sir Reginald Cavendish, Helena Marchmont, Anthony Marchmont, and Dr. Alice Breton arrived in subdued silence. Felicia stood near Poirot throughout, her presence offering quiet endorsement. The meal was modest, served in courses. Conversation was shallow. It was exactly what Poirot had hoped for. After dessert, apple tart, the same that had been served at the club dinner, Poirot rose. "I must ask for your forgiveness," he said calmly, "for this evening was not a remembrance. It was a reconstruction." There was a pause. Then Anthony scoffed. "Another performance?" "Indeed," Poirot replied. "But this time the performance was mine, and I thank you all for playing your parts." He moved to the fireplace. "You see, I believe Lord Marchmont did not die in isolation. I believe he died within an illusion you all helped build, though some of you did not know it." He gestured to the table. The night of his death, Gerald Marchmont's presence at the Claverton Club was assumed, not confirmed. None of you spoke to him at length. None of you noticed his voice, his pins, his shoes. You were told he would be there, and you saw what you expected. Silence. Poirot let it stretch. I also believe Gerald knew his end was coming. He feared disgrace, yes, but he feared something more. He feared exposure, not of a crime, but of a cover-up, one involving finances, legacies, perhaps even misappropriated family funds. There was someone who had more to lose from the truth than Gerald did himself. Now Poirot turned and looked directly at Dr. Alice Breton. You, she said nothing. Poirot continued. You were not merely a guest at the Claverton Club. You were the speaker. You controlled the room. You watched every expression. You guided the conversation. And when Gerald arrived, whether in truth or in proxy, you did not observe him. You observed us. You watched what we believed. And when no one questioned his presence, you said nothing, because you had something to protect. Dr. Breton leaned back. That's quite a theory, Monsieur Poirot. But what would I have to gain? Poirot stepped closer. A continued partnership. Gerald and Helena invested heavily in your psychological clinic in London, but Gerald intended to withdraw. He saw your practices, your so-called therapeutic experiments, as dangerous. He planned to pull funding. You knew it. He even wrote it in the letter Helena burned. Helena's eyes darted sideways. He didn't mention her by name. No, Poirot agreed, but he wrote of the doctor who trades in masks, a metaphor only one man could have penned and only one doctor present could match. Poirot turned again. You knew Gerald would not attend the dinner. He had a private engagement, one I suspect you orchestrated. While you guided the dinner, someone stood in for him. Who, I do not yet know, but I will. That is not what traps you. He pointed to the letter. What traps you is this. Only one person besides Helena knew about the destroyed note, and that person wrote the second message. You tried to redirect suspicion. You wanted us to pursue Anthony. A neat narrative, an emotional one. Poirot's voice dropped. But it was too neat, just like your alibi. Dr. Breton stood slowly, pushing back her chair. This is absurd. There is no proof I killed anyone. No, Poirot said softly. There is no proof yet, but there is a mind. Yours. Brilliant. Calculating. You didn't kill out of rage. You killed because Gerald was going to take everything away. Your funding, your control, your legacy. And so you turned him into a ghost. You helped build the illusion of his presence in London while he lay dying in his own study. Breton's voice was flat. And how do you propose I accomplished that? Poirot smiled. With help, perhaps someone impersonated him for a fee, perhaps even unknowingly. But the puppet master was you. And Gerald, he suspected it. That's why he locked the study door. He knew the trap was already closing, but he underestimated your reach. The room was frozen. Then Breton said, You can't prove any of this. Poirot gave a light shrug. Not yet, but I can press. I can question your staff. I can subpoena records from your clinic, accounts from Gerald's solicitor, medical supplies delivered. If you used poison, it will surface. If you lied about where you were that night after your speech, it will emerge. And when it does, madame, he took a final step forward. Your mind will not protect you. It will betray you, because every genius who commits murder forgets the one thing they cannot control, their own pride. Breton said nothing. She sat down slowly. She did not protest. Poirot let the silence carry the weight of the accusation. Then he turned, took up his gloves, and looked to Felicia. It begins to crack, he said softly. The mirror she built. Later, in private, Ramsden approached Poirot. You think she'll break? Poirot was already scribbling in his notebook. She already has. She attended the dinner to watch us, not to be seen. And when no one noticed Gerald was missing, she knew she'd succeeded. But now she's cornered. Ramsden nodded. You were right. This wasn't about evidence. It was about behavior. Poirot looked up. Exactly, mon ami. A killer leaves no fingerprint in the study, but they leave one in every lie they tell. He closed his notebook and stared out the window. Breton hadn't confessed, but she had been unmasked. And in Poirot's experience, unmasked criminals never stayed silent for long. The following days passed in a blur of shadowed conversations and discreet meetings, but Poirot remained vigilant, watching, listening. The illusion surrounding Lord Marchmont's death had grown thin, but it wasn't yet ready to unravel completely. It had always been clear to Poirot that the key to solving the mystery was not the forensic evidence, nor the inconsistencies in the alibi. It was the psychology of those involved. He had put the pieces together, but one piece still evaded him, slipping between his fingers like quicksilver. Helena Marchmont seemed ever more distant, her carefully constructed facade cracking under Poirot's intense scrutiny. She had no more to offer than polite, defensive answers, always deflecting attention from herself. Yet she was not the real architect of the illusion. No, that had been Dr. Alice Breton. As Poirot had suspected, she had not acted alone, but rather had orchestrated a series of events to ensure her own safety, while feeding others the story of Gerald's tragic accident. Yet Poirot's instincts told him that the game was far from over. The baiting letter, the reference to a hidden letter burned by Helena, was not just a signal for him to pursue Alice Breton as the main suspect. It was a signal that someone had wanted to put him on a false path, to divert his attention away from the real game at play. And then came the revelation. Poirot had planned a final interview with the remaining players, and he called them all to the Marchmont estate once more. Felicia was the first to arrive, her hands still trembling from the strain of the previous days. She had been quiet, withdrawn, and her eyes had been clouded with worry, but she had yet to reveal the truth, whatever that truth might be. Poirot watched her closely as she entered the room. He could tell there was something she wasn't saying, something buried deep within her. "Mademoiselle," he began softly, "you have been under great pressure, I know. But your family's legacy is not only about wealth, it is about the truth." Felicia bit her lip and looked away, hesitating before she finally spoke. "I can't keep up this charade, Poirot. There's more I haven't told you." She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. It was never meant to be this way. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Go on." Felicia stood frozen for a moment before taking a deep breath and continuing. "Gerald didn't just die because of the money or the inheritance. He died because of his own guilt. He was going to expose everything, and he knew that he couldn't live with the truth anymore. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, someone to cover his tracks, to make sure his confession never saw the light of day. That's when he turned to Alice." Poirot's heart skipped a beat. "You mean to say Dr. Breton was involved before Gerald died?" Felicia nodded slowly. "Yes. He trusted her with everything. She knew about the discrepancies in the estate, about the fraudulent transactions. Gerald knew that if he exposed it all, it would ruin the family's reputation, his own reputation. So he decided to make sure the records would never be found. But the guilt consumed him. He was so afraid of what Alice would do with the information if it fell into the wrong hands." Poirot was quiet for a moment. "And you knew of this?" "I didn't know the full extent," she replied softly. "But I knew enough. I knew that Gerald had started to distance himself from us, from everyone, and I feared what might happen. I tried to get him to talk, but he wouldn't. I never thought it would end like this." Poirot's mind raced as the last pieces began to fall into place. He had suspected that there was more to the story than met the eye, but now it was clear. Gerald Marchmont had been desperate to hide the truth. So desperate, in fact, that he had conspired with Alice Breton to falsify his alibi and secure his own legacy. But there was one thing Felicia had not said, one crucial detail that Poirot could not yet see. Before he could probe further, there was a sharp knock at the door, and the final guest arrived. It was Anthony Marchmont. He entered the room, his face pale and drawn, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He avoided Poirot's gaze, his hands clenched at his sides. "Poirot," Anthony began, his voice thick with emotion, "I know you're not finished with me. But I need you to understand. Gerald was my uncle. He may have been stubborn and proud, but he was not the man you think he was." Poirot studied him closely. "I know, Monsieur Marchmont. I know that Gerald was not simply the man he appeared to be. But there is more to his death than meets the eye. You see, Gerald was a man torn between his own secrets and his desire to protect his family's reputation." Anthony looked up at Poirot, his eyes filled with confusion and frustration. "What do you mean?" Poirot's voice was calm. "I believe Gerald was not only protecting his family's legacy, but his own. He had a secret that, if exposed, would have ruined everything he had built, and he was willing to go to great lengths to keep that secret buried." Felicia looked at Poirot, her face filled with a mix of sadness and relief. "So you know everything." Poirot nodded. "I know enough to say that your uncle died because he feared not just for himself, but for those he loved. He was afraid of the truth, Felicia, and Alice knew that fear. She used it against him." Just then, the door opened once more, and Dr. Alice Breton entered the room. Her calm demeanor, the coolness in her eyes, was the perfect contrast to the intensity of the moment. Poirot smiled faintly. "Dr. Breton, I trust you've come to explain your part in all of this." She didn't flinch. "I'm not here to explain. I'm here to offer a warning." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A warning?" "Don't push too hard, Poirot," she said coldly. "You've come close to the truth, but you've also overlooked something. You've focused on the wrong people. You've focused on me. But it wasn't me who killed Gerald. It wasn't me who set this entire tragedy into motion." Poirot's expression hardened. "And who, pray tell, was it?" Dr. Breton stepped forward, her voice cold and deliberate. "It was never about the money. It was never about the family legacy. It was about a man who feared the past, a man who feared what he had done. And it was his own guilt that led him to die the way he did." Poirot stepped closer. "And who, Doctor?" "Breton is the true architect of his death." Her lips curled into a small smile. "The one who never had to play a part. The one who never had to lie. The one who had no reason to fear the past." She paused, her eyes fixed on Anthony. "It was you, Monsieur Marchmont. You killed your uncle's future, not his past." The room fell silent. Anthony's face turned white. Poirot's voice cut through the tension. "It was you all along, the fear of losing everything, the fear of inheritance. The motive was always there, and it was you who manipulated everything to make sure no one would ever question Gerald's death." Anthony shook his head. "No, that's not true. I didn't." But Poirot was already turning to the others, his expression unwavering. "The real killer, I believe, is not the one we suspected. The true architect of this crime, this masterpiece, was the one who stood behind it all, the one who feared both the future and the past." Anthony's breath caught in his throat. Poirot turned to Felicia. "It's time for the final reveal." The room held its breath, knowing that the last truth had finally come to light. The room was charged with an electric tension, as if the very air itself had thickened with the weight of the revelation. Dr. Alice Breton, standing close to the fireplace, kept her composure but could not entirely suppress the small twitch of her lips, a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Anthony Marchmont, on the other hand, stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of disbelief and denial, his hands trembling as if he were trying to grasp onto the remnants of a world that had just crumbled around him. Poirot, however, stood unfazed. His sharp, calculating gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of those who had gathered here. Felicia, whose tears were beginning to well up again. Helena, who had remained almost unnervingly calm throughout the discussion. and now Dr. Breton, the architect of the intricate web that had ensnared them all. "Ah, mon ami," Poirot said softly, his voice breaking the silence. It was never about the money. It was never about the inheritance. It was about the truth. And the fear of that truth, the fear that, once exposed, would shatter everything Gerald had spent his life building. The words hung in the air, and it seemed as if everyone in the room could feel the tension unraveling like a thread pulled from a fabric. Poirot's eyes never left Anthony, who had taken a step back, his face pale as if the very ground beneath him had suddenly become unstable. "Mr. Marchmont," Poirot continued, his tone deliberate, "you thought you could control the story. You thought you could silence your uncle's confessions, but it was the very act of trying to control it that made your guilt more apparent than ever." Anthony opened his mouth, but no words came out. Poirot's gaze flickered to Felicia, who was still standing near the window, her hands clasped in front of her as though she were bracing herself for the storm that was about to break. Her face was pale, but there was a determination in her eyes, as though she had known the truth all along, but had been waiting for Poirot to draw it out. "The letter," Poirot said suddenly, turning back to Dr. Breton. "The one that was burned. Do you know what it contained, madame?" She stiffened, but did not answer. Poirot pressed on. "It was not a letter of regret. It was a letter of exposure. The kind of letter one writes when they know their time is running out. Gerald wrote it because he knew his life was in danger, not from any outside force, but from his own family, and he knew, too, that there were people in this very house who would stop at nothing to ensure that the truth was buried forever." Dr. Breton's lips parted in a quiet, almost inaudible gasp. Poirot moved to the center of the room, his footsteps deliberate. But what Gerald failed to realize, and what you, Dr. Breton, failed to anticipate, is that even the most carefully constructed plans cannot account for one thing: human nature. Felicia's eyes widened. You mean that all along, the truth was right in front of us?" Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "Exactly. The truth was not hidden. It was not buried in a ledger or a document that could be destroyed. It was hidden in plain sight, and it was always in the hands of the person who stood to benefit the most." Anthony's face grew even paler as Poirot's words began to settle in. "No," he whispered. "I didn't." Poirot held up a hand. "You did, Monsieur Marchmont. You did more than you could ever imagine. You manipulated your uncle's death, yes, but you did not kill him. It was not your hand that struck him down." There was a beat of silence, followed by the sharp intake of breath from all those in the room. Poirot continued. "Gerald's death was not the result of a planned murder. It was the culmination of fear. Fear that he was not the man he once thought he was. Fear that he had failed his family, failed his legacy. Fear that you, his own nephew, would destroy everything he had built just to get what you wanted. And that is why he died." Felicia stepped forward, her voice shaking. "So, it wasn't an accident. It was intentional." Poirot shook his head. "It was not a deliberate plan. It was a chain of events, a string of mistakes, but they all led to one place. The moment Gerald realized he had no more control over his life. He had already known about the discrepancies in the estate. He had already seen the financial corruption that ran through the Marchmont bloodline. And he knew deep down that his family, you, Anthony, had pushed him into a corner from which there was no escape. So he staged his own death. But he didn't foresee one thing." "What?" Felicia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot's gaze softened as he spoke the words that would end the charade. "The second crime. The one that sealed his fate. It was not the staged alibi, nor the manipulation of time. No, it was the letter, the one Gerald wrote in his final moments. And it wasn't Alice Breton who destroyed it. It was Helena." Everyone in the room turned sharply to look at Helena, who had remained silent until now. Her face, pale and composed, did not betray the slightest hint of surprise. "You knew, Madame Marchemont," Poirot said gently. "You knew exactly what your husband had written, and you knew that if anyone found out, it would ruin everything. So you destroyed the letter, and then you did something far worse." Helena's lips parted, but no words came out. Poirot took a step closer. "You covered up his death. You destroyed the final piece of evidence that would have exposed the truth. And then you allowed your son to believe it was just a matter of inheritance. Just another family squabble. You used him. You used his fear of being left without a legacy to keep him silent. And in doing so, you allowed your family to believe in the illusion." Helena looked up at Poirot, her face frozen in a mask of cold calculation. "So you think it was all my fault?" she asked, her voice low and steady. Poirot nodded. "It was not only your fault, madame. It was your guilt, your need to protect the family's reputation at any cost, even at the cost of your own soul." The room was still as death itself, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth. Poirot looked at each of them in turn, his voice unwavering. "You all played a part in this tragedy, but in the end, it was not just Gerald's fear that led to his death. It was the fear of the past, the fear of the truth. And it was this fear that trapped you all in a lie." Felicia turned to Helena, her voice breaking. "You didn't protect him. You condemned him. You condemned all of us." Helena's expression did not waver. "I did what I thought was necessary," she said softly, her eyes closing as if the weight of her own words had finally caught up with her. Poirot's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "It was never necessary to sacrifice the truth, Madame Marchemont. That was your mistake." The room fell into an unsettling silence, the truth of Poirot's words settling like dust in the corners. Finally, it was Dr. Breton who spoke, her voice filled with bitterness. "And what of me, Poirot? What happens to me now?" Poirot's expression was unreadable. "You will face your consequences, madame, but know this. Your role was not to murder. No, it was to manipulate the truth, to turn a man's greatest fear into a weapon, and in doing so, you sealed your own fate." The game was over. The pieces had been laid bare, and now the truth had come to light. Poirot turned to Ramsden, who had remained quietly observing the scene unfold. "It is time, mon ami," he said softly. "Time for justice to take its course." As the detectives moved to place the suspects under arrest, Poirot allowed himself one final, quiet thought. He had unraveled the mystery, exposed the lies, and freed the truth from its grave. But even as the culprits were led away, Poirot knew one thing for certain. The most dangerous illusions are the ones we create for ourselves. The evening that followed the arrest was unlike any Poirot had witnessed during his long years of investigating crime. The Marchemont estate was still, the air thick with the realization that something had irrevocably shifted. The staff, still grappling with the revelations, moved with quiet reverence, their faces hollowed by the weight of secrets now laid bare. Even the grand chandelier above the dining hall, which once had glittered with the sparkle of family pride, seemed dimmer, its brilliance no longer able to conceal the darkness that had festered in the Marchemonts' hearts. Poirot stood alone in the grand hall, his hands clasped behind his back as he observed the quiet elegance of the room. Despite the tragedies that had unfolded, there was an undeniable beauty in the place, and yet that very beauty had been marred, irrevocably so, by the lies woven into the family's history. The door behind him creaked open, and he turned to find Inspector Ramsden entering, his brow furrowed, his posture stiff with the strain of the investigation. "Is it done?" Ramsden asked, his voice low. His words carried a weight of both relief and lingering disbelief. "Oui," Poirot replied with a quiet nod. "It is done. But the truth, mon ami, is seldom as clean as the crime itself. It is far messier, more insidious, and far harder to bring to light than any of us would like to admit. Ramsden looked around the hall, his eyes resting on the family portraits that lined the walls, pictures of smiling faces from a time long past, moments frozen in a facade of happiness. "What do you think will become of them now?" Poirot paused before answering, his gaze drifting back to the portraits as well. "They are no longer a family built on legacy, Ramsden. The Marchmont name has been hollowed out, left to rest in the ashes of its own deceit. The truth, once buried beneath layers of falsehood, will consume them as it does everyone who dares to live a lie. Helena, Anthony, and Dr. Breton, they will each face the consequences of their actions in their own way, but in the end, it is not the law that will punish them most. No, it is the weight of their guilt that will haunt them long after their trials are over." Ramsden nodded gravely, understanding the deeper meaning in Poirot's words. He had seen many criminals brought to justice, but there was something more profound about this case. It was not simply the unraveling of a crime, it was the unmasking of a family's soul. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft footfalls of a servant entering, informing Poirot that Felicia had requested to speak with him once more. Poirot glanced at Ramsden, who gave him a silent nod, and made his way toward the drawing-room. Felicia was already seated, her posture stiff, her eyes puffy from crying. The sight of her reminded Poirot that, despite the harsh truth he had revealed, there was no easy resolution to this story. There was no final moment of triumph, no neatly wrapped-up ending. This was not a victory, it was the painful reality of lives shattered by greed, fear, and manipulation. "Come in, Monsieur Poirot," Felicia said quietly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "I didn't know who else to turn to. I don't know what to do anymore." Poirot closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her. His gaze softened. "Mon ami, I understand your pain. You have carried a great burden, knowing the truth while those around you remained blinded by their own desires. It is not easy, but remember this. You did not make the choices that led to this tragedy. You were not the one who sowed the seeds of destruction." Felicia's eyes welled with tears again. "But I knew. I knew what Gerald was hiding, what was happening in our family. I could have stopped it, but I didn't. And now it's all falling apart." Poirot placed a hand gently on hers, his voice firm but compassionate. "You were a daughter, Felicia, trapped between loyalty to your family and the truth. But remember, truth, though painful, is always the better choice. You did not choose to live in the lie, and now you have the opportunity to rebuild, to heal. It will take time, but the first step is always facing the truth head-on." Felicia nodded, though her face remained strained with sorrow. "What happens now, Poirot? What happens to all of us? To the family name?" Poirot stood and walked over to the window, gazing out at the sprawling gardens that stretched beyond the estate. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the landscape, but Poirot could see through the darkness to the tangled mess of vines and undergrowth that had once been neatly pruned and cared for. "The name of Marchmont may never be the same," Poirot said, his voice contemplative. "But the truth, Felicia, is that the family was never about the name. It was about the people within it. You, your brother, and your father, Gerald, were part of a larger story. But in the end, the story of your family is one that must be rewritten." Felicia stood, her face streaked with the remnants of tears, but her eyes filled with newfound resolve. "You're right. We can't go back. We can only move forward." "But how?" Poirot turned back to face her, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You will move forward by reclaiming the truth. You will rebuild, but it must be done honestly. There is no other way. And perhaps with time, your family can find redemption. You can find redemption." Felicia looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then she nodded slowly, as though some weight had lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you, Poirot. You've done more for us than I could ever repay." Poirot shook his head gently. "You owe me nothing, mademoiselle. It is the truth that owes us. We only must be brave enough to accept it." With a final nod, Felicia left the room, leaving Poirot alone to reflect on what had transpired. As he walked back to the hallway, he could hear the muffled sounds of the family packing their belongings, preparing to leave the estate. It was a fitting end, though not one he had expected to see. The Marchmont legacy, once built on wealth and influence, had crumbled under the weight of its own lies. But in that crumbling, Poirot saw the beginnings of something else, a chance at redemption. He turned to Ramsden, who had been waiting patiently in the hallway. "The case is closed," Poirot said quietly, his voice filled with both weariness and satisfaction. Ramsden nodded. "You've done it, Poirot. But I wonder, what now for the Marchmonts?" Poirot's gaze softened as he turned back to the estate one final time. Now, they must learn that the greatest legacy is not one of wealth or titles, but one of honesty and integrity. It is a lesson many must learn the hard way. As Poirot and Ramsden walked away from the Marchmont estate, the moonlight casting long shadows across the grounds, Poirot couldn't help but feel that the real work had only just begun. The truth had been exposed, but the consequences of that truth were still unfolding. Yet, for all the pain and destruction, Poirot knew that the final resolution was never the crime, nor the punishment. The final resolution was always the truth, and how one chooses to face it. The morning after the final gathering at Marchmont Estate felt strangely calm, the air free of the suffocating tension that had dominated the previous days. The family members, still reeling from the emotional toll, had begun to pack their belongings, preparing for the inevitable departure from the estate that had once represented everything they stood for. A house that had witnessed generations of prosperity and scandal alike now stood on the verge of a new chapter, a chapter written by truth rather than deceit. Poirot and Ramsden, after a long night of reflection, had made their way to the drawing room once more. The case was closed in the sense that the guilty parties had been exposed, but as Poirot had reminded Ramsden the previous evening, the consequences of that truth were only just beginning. The revelation of Gerald's death had brought forth a darkness that had been hidden beneath the Marchmont legacy for years, but the true cost of their actions, the damage to the family's integrity and reputation, was something that could not be repaired overnight. "Poirot," Ramsden began, his voice soft as though treading lightly on the fragile reality they were now navigating, "you've solved the case, but what about the aftermath? What happens to them now, to the Marchmonts?" Poirot, who had been standing near the window, his gaze sweeping over the estate as though marking the end of an era, turned slowly to face his colleague. His expression was calm, almost philosophical, as if he had already reconciled himself to the unfolding drama. "Ah, Ramsden," Poirot said, his tone gentle but firm. "The greatest punishment is not always the one meted out by the courts. Sometimes it is the punishment of living with the truth. The Marchmonts will leave this house, yes, but the truth will follow them." Ramsden nodded thoughtfully, but his expression was clouded with uncertainty. "And what about Felicia? She seemed resigned. Will she ever be able to move on from all of this?" Poirot's eyes softened, his gaze drifting toward the empty hallway where the sound of footsteps could be heard echoing faintly. "Felicia is different. She's the only one of them who understood the true weight of what had been done. She was not an active participant in the lie, but she carried it with her, silently, every day. Now that the truth has been exposed, she has the difficult task of rebuilding not just her family's reputation, but her own life." Ramsden remained quiet for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out toward the grounds. "And the others?" Poirot's voice darkened slightly. "Helena, Anthony, and Dr. Breton will face their consequences in time, whether by the law or by their own guilt, but there is no easy escape for them. The guilt they carry will follow them wherever they go. It is the burden of the truth, Ramsden, and it is heavier than any chain." Just as Poirot finished speaking, the door to the drawing room opened softly, and Felicia entered. She had changed into a simple, somber dress, her face pale but resolute. There was a quiet dignity in her steps as she moved toward Poirot and Ramsden, her eyes fixed on the floor as though she was still processing everything that had unfolded in the last few days. "Poirot," she said, her voice steady but laced with a sorrow that only she understood. "I don't know where to begin, but I have to thank you for everything you've done. You've exposed the truth, and in doing so, you've helped me see a way forward. I didn't know how to face what was happening to my family, but now I can breathe again." Poirot gave her a soft smile, his eyes filled with empathy. "Mademoiselle Felicia, it was not I who exposed the truth. The truth has a way of revealing itself, even when we try to hide it. I merely provided the means for you to see it clearly, but it is you who must now move forward, and that will be no easy task." Felicia nodded slowly, her eyes momentarily lost in thought. "It feels like a dream. No, a nightmare. I never imagined the lies would go so deep that they would consume everything. I thought I could protect my family from the truth, but in the end, the truth was what saved us." Poirot took a step closer, his voice quiet but resolute. "The truth always saves, mademoiselle. Though it may bring pain, it is the only path to healing. The family you knew is gone, but from the ashes, a new one can rise, one built on honesty, even if it is painful." Felicia's gaze flickered up to meet his, her eyes still filled with the weight of grief, but with a hint of something else, something more hopeful. "I don't know what will happen to us, Poirot. I don't know how I can rebuild after everything that's happened." Poirot smiled warmly, a flicker of reassurance in his gaze. "That, mademoiselle, is your challenge, and yours alone. The foundation is already there, if you choose to build upon it. You have your family's legacy, you have the lessons learned from this tragedy, and, most importantly, you have the truth." Felicia looked down at her hands, still trembling but with a sense of determination. "I'll do my best, Poirot. I'll do what's right for the family now." Poirot gave a small approving nod. "You are stronger than you know, mademoiselle. It is not the tragedies we face that define us. It is how we rise from them." As Felicia left the room, her steps more purposeful than when she'd entered, Poirot and Ramsden exchanged a glance. There was a silent understanding between them, the knowledge that Felicia's journey was just beginning, and that the others, though facing their own trials, would have to confront the consequences of their actions in ways that would change them forever. But as Poirot had said earlier, the truth was the most powerful force in any story. It had been the truth that exposed the lies, that revealed the hidden motivations, and that freed them from the web of deceit that had ensnared them for so long. It was no easy path, but it was the only one that would allow them to rebuild. Poirot turned toward the window once more, looking out at the estate as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the grounds in a soft, golden light. The Marchmont estate would never be the same. The legacy of the Marchmont family had been shattered, but in its place, something new could emerge, if those who remained were brave enough to face it. "Ramsden," Poirot said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the estate, "do you know what the greatest mystery of all is?" Ramsden looked at him, a puzzled expression on his face. "What do you mean?" Poirot smiled faintly, a sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. "The greatest mystery of all, mon ami, is not the crime we solve, but the choices we make afterward, the way we choose to live in the aftermath of the truth." With that, Poirot turned and walked toward the door, his final thoughts lingering on the family he had just unraveled. The Marchmonts had lived a life of illusion, but the truth had caught up with them, and now they would have to choose how to live in the light. As the door clicked shut behind him, the final curtain fell on the case of Hercule Poirot and the man who killed his own alibi. The mystery had been solved, but the real journey had just begun. The days following the conclusion of the Marchmont investigation were marked by a slow, almost painful silence. The Marchmont estate, once a vibrant symbol of wealth and power, now stood as a somber reminder of the consequences of deceit. The family members, Helena, Anthony, and Dr. Alice Breton, had all been arrested and were undergoing their respective trials. The legal system would have its say, but it was clear to Poirot that their true punishment would be the weight of their guilt, which would haunt them long after the final verdict was passed. Felicia, on the other hand, had left the estate with a quiet resolve. She had decided to leave behind the crumbling remnants of her family's name and start anew. She moved to a small cottage in the countryside, away from the stifling expectations of the Marchmont legacy, where she could begin to rebuild her life in peace. Poirot had spoken with her briefly before her departure, offering words of encouragement. "The past cannot be undone, mademoiselle," Poirot had said, "but it is what we make of the present and future that defines us." Felicia had smiled through her tears. "I will try, Poirot. I will try." Now, as Poirot and Ramsden stood outside the Alibi gates of the Marchmont estate for the last time, the detective reflected on the case. The mystery had been solved, but the truth had left its mark. The family was broken, and the price of their deceit would be paid in ways that no amount of legal justice could remedy. Their reputations would never recover, and the shadow of their actions would follow them for the rest of their lives. Ramsden, ever practical, turned to Poirot as they walked away from the estate. "So, what's next for you, Poirot?" he asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and respect. "Another case, another family to unravel." Poirot smiled, his mustache twitching ever so slightly. "Ah, my friend, there is always a case, always a puzzle to solve. But for now, I believe I shall take a short rest. After all, even a detective needs time to reflect." Ramsden nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he was still processing everything that had happened. "You know, Poirot, I can't help but wonder. If Gerald had lived, would things have been different? Could he have saved the family from all of this?" Poirot thought for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon as they walked along the tree-lined road. Gerald, like many men, was driven by fear. Fear of loss, fear of betrayal, fear of the truth. It is that fear that leads us to make the most terrible decisions. He thought he was protecting his family, but in the end, it was his attempt to control the truth that destroyed them. Ramsden shook his head. "It's a tragic story, Poirot, and it all could have been avoided if they had just faced the truth from the beginning." Poirot nodded, his face solemn. "Indeed. But the truth, Ramsden, is not always an easy thing to face, and many people choose to live in the lie for fear that the truth will expose their weaknesses. They convince themselves that by keeping up the illusion they are protecting others, but in reality they are only protecting themselves." The two men walked on in silence for a few more moments, the weight of the case still lingering in the air between them. Finally, Poirot spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You see, Ramsden, the tragedy of this case is not that the Marchmonts were deceivers. That, sadly, is a common flaw in many families. The real tragedy is that they never understood that the truth is the only thing that can truly set them free. They lived in a world of illusion for so long that when the truth finally arrived, it was too late to save them." Ramsden sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I suppose you're right, but it's hard not to feel sorry for them. They were just so blinded by their own fears and desires." Poirot stopped walking, turning to face Ramsden. "Do not pity them, my friend. Pity is reserved for those who have no other choice but to suffer. The Marchmonts made their choices, and while they may not have understood the consequences at the time, they are now faced with the results of their actions." He paused, letting his words sink in. They are not victims, Ramsden. They are architects of their own downfall. Ramsden nodded slowly, his brow furrowing in thought. I suppose you're right. It's just hard to see it that way sometimes. You can't help but feel for Felicia, though. She seemed like the only one who truly understood what was at stake. Poirot's expression softened as he thought of Felicia. Yes, she understood, and she will, in time, find her way. She will learn that the truth, though painful, is the only thing that can allow her to rebuild. She is not bound by the family's legacy, but by her own choices. Ramsden glanced over at Poirot, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You've got a way of looking at things that makes everything seem simpler than it really is, Poirot. Poirot returned the smile. Ah, but that is the nature of the detective mind, Ramsden. To find simplicity in the complex, to find clarity in the chaos. As they continued walking, Poirot's thoughts drifted back to the case. The Marchmont family's story was one of tragedy, yes, but it was also a story of choices. Choices that led to the breaking of bonds, the shattering of illusions, and the ultimate revelation of the truth. The truth had set them free in the end, but it had come at a steep price. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked out at the horizon. But, he continued, his voice filled with a quiet resolve, the truth is not always a clean thing. It is messy, it is painful, and it often causes more harm than good. But it is also the only way to move forward, and in the end, it is the only thing that can heal. Ramsden looked at him, a sense of understanding dawning in his eyes. I think I get it now, Poirot. It's not about solving the crime. It's about finding a way for people to confront the truth, no matter how difficult that may be. Poirot smiled, his gaze softening. Exactly, mon ami, and that is why we do what we do. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the truth. As the two men reached the end of the road, the Marchmont estate slowly fading from view behind them, Poirot took one last look back at the house. The final chapter had been written, but there would always be more stories to tell, more mysteries to solve. And for Hercule Poirot, that was a path he would continue to walk, one step at a time. The case of the Marchmonts had come to an end, but for Poirot, the work was never truly over. As long as there were lies to uncover and truths to reveal, his work would remain, and he would continue, always seeking the answers that lay hidden beneath the surface. Onward, Ramsden, Poirot said, a note of finality in his voice. The world is full of mysteries, and we have only just begun. With that, they continued walking, the future uncertain but filled with possibility as Poirot's mind raced ahead to the next case, the next puzzle that awaited him. The end. The days following the arrest of Dr. Alice Breton and the other conspirators passed slowly. Poirot, as was his custom, took no pride in their capture. The truth had been unveiled, but the satisfaction he derived was not from the unraveling of the mystery itself. It was from the knowledge that justice had been served, not in the traditional sense, but in the most vital one. Felicia Marchmont had been given the truth, and now it was up to her to choose the path forward. As Poirot sat in his small, modest study, the quiet ticking of the clock beside him the only sound, he felt the weight of the case lift from his shoulders. The Marchmont family was broken, but the truth was no longer their enemy. It was now their only means of healing. He looked at the letter from Felicia that had arrived earlier in the day, her hand still trembling as she wrote, I will try, Poirot. I will rebuild. The truth, though painful, is what will free us. Poirot smiled softly, placing the letter back on his desk. He had done what he set out to do. Unmask the deceit, expose the lies, and reveal the true motives behind Gerald Marchmont's death. The family was left to face the consequences of their actions, but the truth was now in the open, untouchable by further manipulation. He leaned back in his chair, his mind quietly reflecting on the events of the past weeks. The case had been a complex one, layered with deceit, false alibis, and hidden motives. It was a case that tested his skills as a detective, but more importantly, it was a case that tested his belief in the power of truth. The silence of the study was broken by a soft knock at the door. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted as Inspector Ramsden entered, his expression thoughtful. "Poirot," Ramsden began, "I've been thinking about what you said, about how the truth is the only thing that can set people free." Poirot nodded. "It is the truth, Ramsden, that gives us the strength to move forward. Not the past, not the lies we tell ourselves, but the truth." Ramsden stood by the door for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But don't you think some truths are better left hidden? Some things are too painful to face." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, mon ami. The truth is never easy, but it is always necessary. It is the only thing that can guide us through the darkness. Yes, it may cause pain, but it also allows us to grow, to heal." Ramsden looked up at Poirot, his expression softening. "You're right. I suppose I've been so focused on the consequences that I've forgotten the power of the truth itself. Maybe I've been afraid of facing it, just like everyone else in this case." Poirot smiled warmly. "We are all afraid of the truth, Ramsden. It is a natural instinct, but we must learn to embrace it, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Only then can we truly move forward." Ramsden nodded, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you, Poirot. I think I understand now." The two men stood in companionable silence for a few moments, the weight of the case finally lifting. Poirot turned his attention back to his desk, his gaze drifting over the notes and documents he had collected during the investigation. It had been a long road, filled with twists and turns, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. "I suppose," Poirot mused aloud, "that this case is finished. The Marchmonts will face their punishment and Felicia will begin her journey of rebuilding." Ramsden agreed. "It's over. But I can't help but wonder, what happens now? What will they do with the truth?" Poirot smiled. "That, my friend, is not for us to decide. They must decide for themselves. It is the burden of truth, one that no one can escape." As the evening light faded outside, Poirot turned his gaze back to Ramsden, his expression serious. "One thing I have learned in my years of solving mysteries, Ramsden, is that the truth is not always a clear-cut thing. Sometimes it is a long and painful journey to uncover. But in the end, it is the only thing that can bring clarity." Ramsden nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand that now." Poirot's voice softened, his gaze distant. "And perhaps that is what makes us who we are, our willingness to seek the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it costs us everything. That is the essence of justice." A long silence followed as both men stood in the room, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Finally, Ramsden spoke again, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Poirot. I don't think I'll ever look at things the same way again." Poirot's smile returned, warm and reassuring. "It is the nature of truth, Ramsden. It changes everything." As Ramsden left the study, Poirot sat back in his chair, his hands folded neatly in front of him. The case was complete, the mystery solved, and the truth exposed. But even as he sat in the stillness of his study, Poirot knew that the work of a detective was never truly over. There would always be another case, another mystery to unravel. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The Marchmont family had been torn apart by lies, but through the revelation of the truth, they would have a chance to rebuild. And as Poirot looked out the window at the fading light of the day, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The truth had won. It always did. And that, in the end, was enough.